Our guest this morning is Sebastian Salicru. He treats leadership as a research discipline, a critical social phenomena, an essential business practice.
I'm a business psychologist, that's my background, and I like to do research and write and publish, but specialize in leadership development specifically, yes.
What about your wife took you into focusing on leadership development?
I work for a number of years in OD, and in recent years I found that has become a very, very important thing. I also believe we have a leadership crisis that I talk about in my book, Leadership Results. And I think we could do things much better.
So let's start there. Because I've only been here a couple of days and I've heard people talking about the leadership crisis politically.
That's one we see in television every day, yeah. But I think it's a corporate one as well. You know, organizations to spend millions or billions of dollars literally, and they're not getting the results they want. Hence the title of my book, Leadership Results. And in fact, there was an article in Harvard Business Review a few months ago labeling the industry as a training robbery. And I think it's very sad. Companies are being robbed because they're paying so much money.
What do we do about that? We look at the data about the ability to transform organizations, and that data has not improved markedly over the last 20-some years.
The same applies to employee engagement. It tends to fluctuate, but overall fee is still low. Like in the country where I live, the estimated cost of lack of engagement is $55 billion. And I would suspect in the US it's much higher. But, generally speaking, I think we have a problem.
And looking at the amount of suffering people experience doing the thing that they're paid to do, and we would hope they would love doing, but they don't love doing.
And I was talking about this at the last conference in Spain. One of the things I talked about was about that whatever you look at suffering, you look at violence, you look at a very sad thing, really.
Do you have recommendations for what to do about it?
I do. I identified at least 10 key areas that need to be looked at, but I think that it's probably not worth it go into those. But generally speaking, I think what's happened is that the world has changed. If you look at it in technology, we use new technologies. But in terms of developing leaders, so to speak, or doing leadership, I think we're still using very old, outdated ways of thinking.
And that's the foundation for my entire book, this whole idea. Are you innovating how you lead?
Yeah. I think most of all, in general, we still hold very dearly to that view of the heroic leader, usually a man, of course, of great attributes. Superman is going to go there and fix everything. And I think this is no longer. I'm not saying they might be very charismatic and very good people. I'm not trying to diminish that, but I'm saying that we need to look at new forms of leadership.
Well, and the whole Leader 2050 focus says that it is not what we saw traditionally, the Marvel Man or Marvel Comics superheroes. It's not that. It is, in fact, more deliberate, more thoughtful, often quieter, not big ego.
So, essentially, in times of turbulence, let's use that term, the other terms like VUCA, I say times of, high velocity, complexity, turbulence, all those terms. So that generates a great deal of confusion and fear. And during those times, people ask a very important question. I think we all ask, and that is, what is the story? So sense making is a relatively simple term that is around providing people with a sense of what's around them, and is actually one of the 4 dimensions of the model of leadership development that Ancona uses, Professor Ancona, MIT. So sense making, inventing, relating. Sense making is one of them. So I think an important task of leaders today is to make sense of that reality, first for themselves and then for others.
And when we look at leadership maturity, we talk about maturing our ability to make sense of things.
Yeah.
That resonates entirely with me, the idea of sense making.
Yeah. So then the next question is, well, how they do that. So first it is about making sense for themselves, but then it's how they become sense givers, if you like. Invariably, that's through language. We are linguistic beings. So it's the use of narratives and storytelling. I looked at those 2 literatures very much, sense making and storytelling. So that's why those 2 literatures interest me a lot, the sense making literature and the storytelling one. So it's about how their leaders develop their narratives, the stories, individual stories and collective stories, to help people to first make sense and then to communicate and use them as springboard for action.
Just to restate, we're in a turbulent or high velocity time.
Yeah.
And I, as a leader, need to make sense differently than I did 5 years ago. More complex, more interconnected, more global, and faster moving. And it's my job to make sense for myself of everything that's happening, and then how people around me come to a similar sense as I have.
Yeah, help them to make sense. So as a leader, then you become a sense giver. And the analogy that I use in the book is that they're no longer maps. You know, people get lost somewhere and they find a map, and eventually they navigate and they get safe to the base. But when they get there, they arrive, they realize that the map is a different map. It's from another mountain. But yet the map helped them to get energized, the confidence, the optimism to get there.
So first me traveling around Brussels.
Yeah. So sense making is not so much concerned with accuracy. It's more about plausibility, if you like. It's about we can make choices even though we don't understand what happened, but it's how we make sense of it. So it's an interesting concept when you look at it.
So I would say it helps me be directionally correct, though, right?
Yeah, it helps at least to center yourself, to believe in something, to have that hope and that confidence to move forward, and to tap into the inner resources, if you like. Like when those people get lost into the mountain, although the map is not the actual map of the terrain, territory, they don't know that. But the belief that that is something triggers the inner resources. They become a lot more present to the situation, more optimistic, more confident, start to remember things they've learned throughout their lives, help each other, collaborate, and eventually they make it.
It really does seem like my navigating around Brussels with cold days. I look at the Google thing and it says 3 minutes, and then it says 9 minutes, and then it says 12. Clearly I'm going the wrong direction, and I'm kind of paying attention to my phone and not looking at the buildings around me.
It's a matter also then using more your intuition and creativity. We live now in times where everybody talks about data, big data. And of course data is important, but it's not everything. You ask me personally, I think the qualitative piece, it's always on top. What do you stand for? Where are you going? What's your vision? The qualitative piece is always the one that provides meaning.
I'm listening to the book by the CEO of Microsoft, where he talks about hit refresh. And very much as they're going through challenges like, how do we deal with government wanting information about terrorists, and do we unlock algorithms? He continually goes back to values. And it's more about, what do we stand for? What do I stand for? I value security, but I also value confidentiality. So how do we make that decision? And he balances, but continually I hear him going back to first values and then the data.
That centers you. I think it was General Shortcloth in the US.
Schwarzkopf, yeah. Stormy Norman.
Yeah, he talks about strategy and character and leadership. And he says, if you have to choose with one, you go with character. And to me, it makes a lot of sense as a leader. What's your character? The content is changing so fast that strategy tomorrow won't be valid any longer anyway.
We need to have it, but have it held loosely.
Yeah. There is a Spanish poet, Machado, I think it's called. There's a poem that talks about that you make the way as you walk. There is no way.
That's something it's important for our listeners to hear, because so many people want to get it right. It's not real.
Exactly. And if we are to engage people, if we are to use more distributive or collective ways of leading, it's about everybody having that sense of, who they are and where they're going, and understanding that nobody's going to be there to hold your hand,
Well, especially now when things are changing faster than we can make sense of. So we continue to refine through the filter of our wisdom, and unwise is not helpful. It's been interesting teaching grad students, because they come in thinking they want kind of the through books. Yeah.
They want the 7 steps. Tell them that how long ago was that? Come on, And that's the problem. We still use those ways of thinking, mental models, code, whatever you like, of 20 or 30 years ago, and expect them to use today. We need to update our mental software. We're very good about updating our iPhones and all that, but we still use the old mental software.
In fact, one of my taglines is don't be the flip turn of leadership. If this room were full at this moment, a full room of people who hear you saying, I need to update, but what the heck does that mean? What do I do to make that happen?
Well, you need to question what are your assumptions? What are your expectations? You need to be open to look at new ways of thinking, being, and doing.
I have to update myself to update my son's making machine.
If you like, yeah. I mean, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, what we're doing could be changed. It's like leadership training, I think always people expect that structure, if you like, module 1, module 2. So when I work with people in the leadership space, I tend to work more with whatever they work in, but see how it emerges as the group grows. So that sets the agenda, if you like. And that helps them to get the work done as well. So that thing that you go to a training program and then you go back to work and you've got to look at all this transfer of learning, knowledge and skills and whatever. That's a bit of an old hat as well, Then you got all the pieces of action learning literature and all that, Brown and stuff, which I know that a lot of people use, but I think this needs now to be very prominent and taken up. I like the work of Rayling as well, Joe Rayling. You've probably known him.
But many of our listeners don't.
Joe Rayling was based in Boston, I think it's at Northwestern, talks about leadership as practice.
Oh, I love that idea.
Yeah, and he talks about leaderful organizations. So I really like his work. In fact, when I read it, I thought, oh, wow, this guy knows how I think. And it's more about being tuned to what's happening. And this goes with a term that's very used today, which is mindfulness. What's being mindful? Being here, being now, being here for each other, and see what emerges out of our conversation.
And action learning for people who are also unfamiliar with that. I learned something, I put it into practice. I also talk about the leader taking on the mind of the scientist. I have a hypothesis that this will work. I test it.
Exactly. It's about keep questioning and working on real-time issues. So look, I understand that all this is a little bit more abstract than the way we thought traditionally, but that's the way it is. Life is more complex. So I know we tried to make it simple, but we need to look at things from a different perspective. There is another term I like to use. I said, you go into this corner of the room, you see one perspective, and if you don't shift around, if you don't move it, you will never see any perspective. And a lot of people inadvertently, they are aware of it, but they keep looking at the Ruri from the same perspective.
I work with a lot of technology leaders, but any functional area.
Exactly.
And as I hit a certain level, I need to take on the perspective of the general organization. I also have to stand in my corner, but then I have to stand in your corner to see your point of view.
And that leads me to another piece that has been very popular, and that's the adaptive leadership, which is that we still keep treating all these complex problems or adaptive problems as technical problems, particularly technical people, IT people, engineers. They see everything from a technical perspective, and that's why they keep failing,
So again, adaptive leadership is basically the problem solves me. I don't just solve it, but I need to change in the process.
Yeah, you need to, exactly. And the change takes place in different places. And it is also about what you were saying, that you keep hypothesizing. So it's a bit like a scientist, you keep asking and then you expect that you might be wrong, but that's a good thing because now you don't know where you go elsewhere. It's about, understanding the stakeholders and their perspective. It's also about putting pressure into the system. That's risky because sometimes if you don't put enough pressure, things don't change. And if you put too much pressure, as Harvard says, you blow up.
Which is why I say good scientists are not dope scientists. Well-conducted experiments are hard.
Yeah. Interesting. My book was something asked me, what about leaders? Like, they mentioned Kennedy. I said, well, if you look at it, all the those you mentioned, they were killed. So when you're trying to put too much change, the system doesn't want it. The system will take care of that. That's why it's doing this. Go out there all excited, I'm going to do that. It doesn't work. Most people, you go back, whatever you work, if you work for someone, the first thing they'll do is tap into your shoulder. If you don't jump the same height you did before, they're going to get very worried.
If you don't jump the same way. Well, and so we talk about leadership training failings, but it's not necessarily the training. It's putting people back into the same culture where we don't always really want them to change.
Because you start seeing new things. You see, that's the thing. And that's what I really try to do in my work. After the experience of development, trend, call it whatever you like, you see things in a different way. You see things that before were invisible to you, or beneath the iceberg, if you like to use the analogy iceberg. So now you see different things. So you can't be the same person again. And other people may have difficulties with that because they can't relate in the same way anymore.
I'm shaking my head because I've been there.
I have to confess, I'm maybe a bit skewed to that way. You know, I'm a bit of a rebellious by nature. We like to do what we like to do. And if we have all these constraints, we get suffocated.
And it gives you an opportunity to really be a scientist, to really hypothesize and test. And for clients who are interested in that magnitude of change, they hire you. Clients who aren't may hire you, but they don't retain you as long.
This is a price to pay.
And yet that is the price of progress.
Any change comes, there is a pain, is a transition. I talk about leadership transitions and initiations. You know, great leaders always, I believe, been initiated and gone through a great deal of suffering. People like Mandela, for example.
If you were to summarize your initiation.
My initiation was like this. I was exposed to leadership when I was quite young. When I was 13 years of age, my father died.
Oh, goodness.
And that really shook my world. And the first thing my mother said to me was, "Now you're the head of the family and need to look after me and you three younger brothers." I failed miserably. I didn't do a good job, but it took me...
You were 13.
Exactly. But it took me decades to realize that. Not until I looked at leadership seriously and I read things like Abraham Lincoln that says that it's not about whether you fail or not, but whether you're content with your failures. Or Nelson Mandela that says it's not whether we fail, but it's every time we rise. Even Bill Gates talks about that. It's more important to learn from failures than successes. And even Steve Jobs, don't be afraid of failure. So at that point, I understood that I needed that failure. I needed that initiation to go into that liminal space to experience what is it like to fail. Because when you fail, you have to surrender to something bigger than yourself. You have to trust others. And leaders that have not been initiated abuse their power. And we have a lot of them around the world because they believe they can get anything they want for their own self-serving. And that's because they never had an initiation. They don't understand that the role is served to others.
So you and I should start the corporate initiations.
I call it initiation coaching. And again, so it's a bit like the question has always been, are leaders made or born, you know? Well, I say, well, either. How about they initiate it?
Sebastian, thank you. This is such a delight.
So if people are more interested, chapter 6 of my book talks specifically about initiation.
So again, give us the name of your book, where we can find it.
Well, it's called Leadership Results, How to Create Adaptive Leaders and High-Performing Organizations for an Uncertain World. Again, it's a long topic, but Leadership Results is easy to remember.
Okay, and it's available on Amazon?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon and many online. But
And your name is?
Sebastian Salicru. Salicru. Salicru.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute delight.